Since its introduction in October 2001, the iPod has had a meteoric rise. It's gone from an idea to over 70 million sold worldwide. This is the story of how it changed an industry and became a cultural phenomenon, beginning with Steve Jobs' return to the company he co-founded.
Thank you very much.
Through the birth of the idea.
Music was the perfect synthesis for Apple.
And its nerve-wracking development.
For the 8 months of development on the iPod, it was extremely tense.
To the simple stroke of luck that helped transform the iPod from a tech gadget into an icon.
No company had ever cared before about the color of the darn earbuds. But all of a sudden, that became a symbol, and people are like, what is that?
This is the inside story of the iPod.
We're sorry.
The iPod started with a smile. On the 20th of December 1996, Steve Jobs was smiling.
Thank you very much.
That was the day it was announced he would return to Apple. More than 11 years after being banished from the company he had co-founded.
It's a wonderful Shakespearean story. I mean, it really is. Steve had left Apple in 1985 because of a coup that he tried to foment against John Sculley. John Sculley had been handpicked by Steve to run Apple, and then the two men came to loggerheads. The company had spent years not knowing what to do. Under John Sculley, it had floundered around, tried to continue to build Macs, not gone anywhere.
When Steve Jobs came back to Apple, Apple had been losing $1 billion a year. Its stock had fallen from about $60 a share to $17 a share. To a lot of people in the industry, a lot of very smart people, it really looked like Apple was in a death spiral.
The brand was limping. The products were terrible. They were uncompetitive. Some of the strongest loyalists of the Apple brand were beginning to defect to Microsoft. It was a terrible, terrible state. In fact, the board was thinking of selling Apple and closing shop. When Steve Jobs returned, it was like the return of the Messiah.
When Jobs came back, he knew he had to make changes. He started by slashing Apple's overgrown product line. Among the casualties, the Newton, Apple's foray into the PDA market.
Okay, when Steve got back to Apple, the first thing he did was can the Newton. The Newton had been a handheld machine built by Sculley, early days with handwriting recognition. It was sort of cool in some ways, but it didn't have Steve's imprint on it. It had John Sculley's imprint. He wasn't about to go put a lot of money behind that.
Jobs then reduced the number of projects in development from 50 to 10.
When he got back to Apple, he took a look at all the products that Apple had and essentially called in the engineers, and to each one of them said, take a look at this. What's wrong with this product? And so everyone sort of hummed and hawed. And Steve said, well, I'll tell you what's wrong. They're crap.
When Steve Jobs came back to Apple, he had a bit of a reign of terror where he would meet people on campus and he would say, who are you? What do you do? So stories went around about Steve Jobs bumping into people he didn't know on elevators in campus. And by the time the elevator door opened, the people were fired.
Steve wasn't looking to create a particular product. It wasn't this big plan to do this one thing. What it was to create a milieu, create an environment where the right thing will pop into your head and you'll just be hit with it like a thunderbolt. Steve has said many times, and I think he's right about this, you can't ask somebody what they want next. They don't know. They can't tell you what they're going to want next. They just know when they see it that it's going to be the right thing.
He had to change the way the outside world viewed Apple, the way customers viewed Apple, and the way the people who worked at Apple thought about the place. So Jobs did the now famous Think Different advertising campaign. It wasn't just an ad campaign. Before, everyone looked at Apple and said, here's a company that has a tiny percentage of the market. They're losers, they're on the margins, and that this is a bad thing to be. And Jobs comes in and he reframes the notion and he says, no, it's good to be in the 1 or 2% of people who are original thinkers, who are mavericks, who are innovators.
But changing the company culture was just the first step. The real test was whether Jobs and Apple could create products that would actually sell. When Steve Jobs returned to Apple Computer in 1996, he quickly created a new image for the company and transformed the corporate environment. Success soon followed. In May 1998, Apple released a product that reflected Jobs' new energizing spirit. The iMac was a hit.
Despite a loyal following, the obituary notices began to appear, but guess what? Mac is back.
The colourful all-in-one computer seemed to perfectly match the new digital lifestyle of the young and the youthful. In just 45 days, Apple sold nearly 300,000 iMacs. It was an impressive debut.
They looked so good, you kind of want to lick them.
The launch of the iMac was really important in setting the groundwork for the coming of the iPod, because the iMac was the first kind of new computer to hit a home run with youth culture. And so when all other computer products were boring and gray, he gave them basically a cool fashion computer product, and they'd never seen anything like that before.
While the iMac was a step in the right direction, it was still just another computer. The most important catalyst for the iPod was a phenomenon that was completely unexpected and took the world by storm. It began in a university dormitory in Boston, Massachusetts.
Sean Fanning was a freshman at Northeastern University in Boston in 1998, and he had a roommate who, like many people, liked listening to MP3s. But the roommate complained to him that he could never find them. There'd be a list of links on mp3.com or some other site, and then he'd click through, and the link would be gone. It would be dead. He couldn't hear the music.
Here's this young college kid, and he has a very basic need. He wants to share music with his friends. It's pretty basic. And there was no service out there giving him what he wanted. So he just created it.
Sean Fanning invented a piece of software that allowed users to share MP3 files across the internet. He named it after his own online nickname, Napster.
When Sean released it, it was really released to his friends, and then his friends gave it to his friends, and then their friends. It went from 50 people to 1,000, and then the next week it was at 2,000, and then it started to grow logarithmically. So I think by the end of a month, we were already pushing 10,000 users.
Within a year, Napster was being used by more than 60 million people around the world, making it the fastest growing company in history and public enemy #1 of the recording industry.
The record industry was absolutely terrified of Napster. They'd been tracking it for months before they sued. There was a meeting where all the heads of the record industry were together with Hillary Rosen, and she said, let's do a little demonstration.
I had a number of the record label heads in the room. These were the ultimate music men and women of the industry. And we literally sat there for 45 minutes while they threw out names of obscure songs and hit songs and everything they could think of, literally playing sort of Find That Tune, and every single thing they named was available from somewhere on Napster. And those guys just walked out of the room blown away.
A federal court judge granted a temporary injunction against Napster, pending a trial on charges by the recording industry that Napster violates copyright laws by stealing artists' songs.
Whilst the record companies succeeded in shutting Napster down, one thing became perfectly clear. A digital music revolution had begun. Steve Jobs took note.
Once it dawned on Steve and his executives that this thing was happening on the internet with music, they knew that they had been missing an opportunity. They did photos, movies, and it was really not until a second iteration of the iMac that the iMac became something that you could burn CDs on and use music on.
Steve knew that Napster was a giant success. He knew that this was happening. Steve was looking for some way to manage songs, manage music. He wanted Apple users to have a product that enabled you to take your CDs, put them into a Mac, rip the song, and play them back.
Apple found, a company which was actually populated by former Apple people that made a product called SoundJam. And SoundJam was taken in, and within a few months, they transformed that program into something that looked like a Mac program, and that was called iTunes.
In January 2001, Jobs took the stage at the Macworld Expo to announce iTunes, Apple's jukebox software. It was the company's first step into the digital music realm.
A Steve Jobs keynote presentation is like a Rolling Stone show.
Thank you all for coming.
You may have seen a lot over the years, but you never want to miss one. In the year 2001, he came to Macworld and brought iTunes, which was the first Macintosh jukebox. This was something that really pushed the limits of what a jukebox could do. It was more beautiful. It was easier to use than anything, either on the Macintosh certainly, but also in the Windows world. And you knew right then that Apple was deep in the game in digital music.
To us, at its core, it's all about the music.
For Steve, music was the natural thing. It was the perfect synthesis for Apple because Steve understood that music was part of our DNA. I mean, computer, let's be honest, it's sort of a 20th century thing. Typing on a keyboard and looking at a screen, and it's not an intuitive, primal thing. Music is a primal thing. It's something that's been with human beings since drums in the jungle. So, this was something where if he could pull it off right, he could take the digital world, marry it to that primal thing, and make something really important.
That digital primal thing would transform Apple. But it would take more than iTunes to bring about the change.
iTunes was a way to move your files around and to organize your files on your computer. But what did you really want to do? You wanted to be able to wander around with the songs. You want to be tethered to your desk. You want to go jogging. Steve realized this, and he sent his team out to look at the MP3 marketplace. And what was available was not anything that any of them would like. In fact, they stank.
There was a flash-based one from Diamond, the Rio. There was the Iger MP Man, the first MP3 player. There was one hard drive-based player from Compaq. But they were expensive, and people really didn't know about them.
What was fascinating was that the one electronics company that should have figured it out, Sony, had completely dropped the ball. Sony, who had built the original portable music player that became a worldwide phenomenon, had completely missed this market.
When Napster opened the door, everybody in the business should have said, holy smoke, here's this huge opportunity. How do we service this audience?
Now, Steve knew that Sony didn't have this product. They hadn't figured it out. Thought, wow, there's a real opportunity here. We could build something better than anybody's got.
By early 2001, Apple executives had decided to enter the MP3 player market. An independent engineer named Tony Fadell was trying to do the same.
Apple at the time was looking to get into the MP3 player market, and along came this independent contractor, Tony Fadell, who'd worked at Philips and General Magic, and he'd been developing handheld devices for them. And his idea was to make a hard drive MP3 player that was also tied to an online store.
Apple wanted to build an MP3 player, and I think Steve had already decided this was a fertile area. So there's this guy, Tony Fadell, around who's got an idea. The guys at Apple decided, look, we could either build it ourselves, take a year or two to get it out there. Or just like we started iTunes with SoundJam's design, we could put our own magic around it and we could have a product out in a much more rapid time frame.
The same month that iTunes was launched, Steve Jobs made a momentous decision. Under heavy secrecy, he assembled a team to develop the iPod. Jobs set a near impossible deadline. He wanted the device ready for the holiday season, only 9 months away.
The Apple iPod development schedule was about 9 months, and it was extremely tense. There was no pizza parties. It was show up on Saturday, show up on Sunday, work all week. It was a very, very tight schedule. So about a month into the project, we fly down to Cupertino to meet with the Apple folks. There's about maybe a dozen of the Apple executives in the room. And Tony Fadell storms into the room and he says, folks, this is the project that's going to remake Apple. In 10 years, this is going to be a music business, not a computer business.
Initially, Steve Jobs wasn't that involved until it started to come together. And towards the end, the meetings went from weekly to daily, and he became very, very involved.
Steve used to give a lot of feedback on the audio. He has a very gifted knack for detecting harmonics. He could tell you right away if it sounds good, if it doesn't sound good. He would give reports back to us that the buttons weren't clicking fast enough, or you couldn't get to the song you wanted in less than 3 clicks.
If you know a Steve Jobs product, you know that he likes simplicity. The very first Macintosh, for instance, had no cursor keys, even though every computer should have cursor keys. Similarly, he didn't want an off switch on the iPod. He wanted the fewest switches possible.
Especially in the polishing and the design, the aesthetics, the use, the interface. His personality is all over that. I mean, it was that typical Steve Jobs insistence on the best experience.
2/3 of the way through the development phase, the iPod hit a snag.
Towards the end of the development cycle, they were setting up the factories to make the thing, and they discovered that they had a problem with the power management.
About 3 months before the end of the project, we find out that the iPod is going dead after about 3 hours, even when it's turned off. And that battery life just isn't acceptable. And the mood around the office was that we either fixed it or we might as well go home.
For 8 stressful weeks, engineers scrambled to fix the problem. Finally, they did. After months of round-the-clock work, the iPod was ready. Jobs sent an email to the media inviting them to the launch of a new Apple product. It simply read, hint, it's not a Mac. On the 23rd of October 2001, Steve Jobs unveiled Apple's newest creation.
The iPod introduction was another great moment of Steve. He shows up and he says, I've got this new thing I'm going to show you today, but I'm not going to bring it out right yet. And he kind of wanders around the stage and he whets the appetite and he reaches into his pocket and pulls out the iPod.
There it is, right there.
He says, this is the first day in a whole new revolution.
This amazing little device holds 1,000 songs, and it goes right in my pocket.
The place was filled with journalists who all looked at this and were going, what is this? Nobody really knew what he was up to.
No one was really expecting them to come out with an MP3 player.
It is now accessible to everybody to have 1,000 songs and find them and navigate them faster.
They basically just made it an incredibly easy to grasp proposition for most people.
When the iPod came out, Bill Gates was in New York City and was having a dinner for a few journalists. And I had just gotten my iPod, and I decided to bring it to that dinner. Bill Gates had not seen the iPod, and before I left, I showed it to Bill, and his eyes went like saucers, and he immediately started playing with it and taking it in. And he looked at me and he said, "This is only for Macintosh?"
But the timing of the iPod launch in October 2001 could not have been worse.
Well, the iPod was launched at the least auspicious time. Napster had just been sued and had lost. Everyone who had been sharing MP3 files was shell-shocked. Second of all, 9/11 had happened a month before. The country was shell-shocked. The dot-com meltdown had started earlier in the year, and the Silicon Valley economy was falling apart. There was very little reason to be excited about any kind of new product.
It was a little bit early in the market, and so no one was really sure how this digital music thing was going to play out. And so it seemed like Apple was making a pretty risky move into what was so far a pretty unproven market.
When the iPod first came out, a lot of people were very skeptical about it. It was quite expensive. It was $400. It was Mac only. People said the iPod stood for idiots price our devices, or I prefer owning discs in reference to CD players.
Despite the early criticism, the iPod had a certain something.
There are a few different things that made the iPod really stand apart from the rest of the crowd. One is that its excellent integration with iTunes. What Apple was able to achieve was a level of seamless integration with the software that almost no one else has been able to do.
The iPod, when it came out, was already not the best music player. That is, it wasn't the most capacious, it wasn't the least expensive. But what it was a fashion statement. It was a piece of jewelry. It was so beautiful.
You know, it's one thing to have a bunch of songs on a device, but it's useless unless you can find what you're looking for. The competition did allow you to search by artist and album, but what it didn't do, once you got to a song list, you'd be clicking, click, click, all the way through, and when you have 5,000 songs on there or more, it's just not gonna work. With the iPod, you'd start scrolling, you'd be like, and then it speeds up. It's like, all the way through. And you're like, whoa, that was just mind-blowing.
Most important, the iPod had a band of Mac loyalists eager to embrace it.
Well, Apple started with an advantage which almost no other brand has, which is an incredibly loyal cult base of users. So when the iPod came out, it was grasped with enthusiasm by that group. It was a fantastic reason to evangelize the brand to their friends, to anyone else who would listen.
So sometimes tech products stay in tech and never make it out of the geek world. So from the very beginning, the people who adopted the iPod were these Mac loyalists. And in that group, there were some very other influential communities that helped start the conversation, and they were what I call the cultural creatives. If a product has sparked the interest of fashion, of car culture, of music, of sports, I mean, we're in so many areas of culture that now there's great momentum and an avalanche of interest starting with all the right people, and that's what happened with the iPod.
In its first 2 months, the iPod ended up in the hands and ears of about 125,000 people, including many of the world's trendsetters. That was important, but it wasn't enough. It would take a stroke of luck for the rest of the world to take notice. When the iPod was launched in late 2001, it proved an immediate hit with Macintosh enthusiasts. But it was a seemingly minor design detail that turned this electronic gadget into a fashion statement.
When the iPod first came out, it was, of course, Macintosh-only fans, younger people, urban people, began to see for the first time these white earbuds. White earbuds. No company had ever cared before about the color of the darn earbuds. But all of a sudden, that became a symbol, and people are like, what is that?
They made the earbuds white just because the player was white. They wanted to keep it consistent with the color of the player. But it turned out to be a brilliant piece of marketing because it advertised a player that's normally hidden in a pocket or a backpack, something that's invisible, something you don't see, and it made it very visible.
You're walking down the street, you see a cool person, and you see some visible accessory that you've never seen before. And you think, what's that, and why is that guy wearing it? And then you see it again, and then you see it again, and then suddenly you start taking notice that every person I see with those white earbuds is a cool looking person. And then you start really wanting it. You want to be part of that community.
Now, Apple picked up on that and noticed that the cool people had the white earbuds, and they began to put it into their advertising. And the white earbuds became the hero, the piece of iconography that said, this is who we are, and you belong if you have one of these.
With the iPod, the word-of-mouth messaging wasn't only coming from the corporation, it was coming from that cool DJ that was using it at a party, or the fashion designer who's designing a line of accessories for the iPod. And that's what gave it its legitimacy.
Sensing its growing popularity, the media jumped on the iPod bandwagon. Soon, the little white device was news. Articles on celebrity playlists and TV stories added even more buzz to the growing iPod craze.
Sales of digital players are expected to top the 10 million mark this year. But the trendsetter, even in the nation's heartland, is the iPod with its distinctive white earbuds.
Steve started to realize that Apple was no longer going to be a computer company. Apple was a media company. In fact, I think he said the iPod was going to produce more than 50% of their revenue. Steve had already realized that this was the tail that was going to wag the dog.
Just a year and a half after the iPod's introduction, the tribe of white earbuds approached 1 million strong. The iPod phenomenon had taken hold. While sales continued to ramp up, Steve Jobs turned his attention to selling digital music. With MP3 giant Napster vanquished, the record industry struggled to figure out how they could sell music online.
After they sued Napster out of existence, the record companies were on their defensive. The public wanted digital music, and the record industry wasn't winning any points by saying no, no, no.
There were never any statistics released just exclusively about losses for Napster. But in a period of about 3 years, the industry went from almost $15.5 billion a year in annual sales to about $12.5 billion. So when you are in a world where everybody says your business should be expanding because of these great digital opportunities, it was a pretty devastating time.
People had quickly grown used to getting their digital music for free. Getting them to now pay for it wasn't going to be easy.
Nobody really knew what distribution business model was going to work, whether it would be selling downloads, selling albums, or subscription services. The few businesses that had started a subscription weren't doing very well.
While record labels and technology companies began to discuss launching their own initiatives, Steve Jobs had a plan. An online music store where millions of songs from every record label would be available for purchase. Users would buy them and seamlessly transfer them to their iPods.
Steve, I think, understood in a way that very few people did, that you wanted to own your own music. It was your music. You bought a CD, it was yours. The great idea of the record industry was that you were going to buy a subscription to their music. And as long as you paid, you could listen to the song. But if you stopped paying, you'd lose it. So essentially, you were renting music. Steve told them from the very beginning this was a brain-dead idea.
Actually, the labels were not interested in doing a deal with Apple at all. And to understand why, you kind of have to look at the relationship that happened between labels and MTV about 2 decades earlier. So MTV took off as this little startup, this company that could only show videos. And what ended up happening over the next 2 decades was that MTV basically became the power broker in the music industry. So the thinking when Apple came along was, well, why are we going to create this other powerhouse outside of our building? We don't want to do it.
But the recording industry learned that it's not easy to say no to Steve Jobs.
I think his intensity and charisma and just selling this thing was really important. I mean, he was an evangelist like none of the other tech companies had. You know, Microsoft would send their, VP of doodads into meetings with music folks. There aren't too many computer industry CEOs that artists are able or willing to sit down and talk to. But Steve, people wanted to meet.
Steve cared so much about the record industry and getting the music for iTunes that he would fly down to Burbank all the time to go talk to record industry executives. He became a regular on Southwest Airlines. Steve Jobs had the personality and the charisma and the name to get into people who no one else could get into. To be able to go to Dr. Dre, a notorious rapper, and be able to convince him that he should download his songs through the iPod and iTunes world.
The labels were intrigued with Jobs' pitch, but there was one sticking point. Jobs wanted to sell individual songs at 99 cents a pop. Some of the record companies and their artists demanded he sell albums in their entirety.
It wasn't so much that the record companies believed that Steve had the model with selling singles. It's that Steve believed he had the model. And what he said to them was, I want to do this. And the only way I'm willing to do it, if you let me tear these albums apart. U2, they said, no, we create concept albums and we want you to sell our whole album. And literally Steve and Bono and The Edge, they all spent time together and Steve convinced them to give his idea a try. And ultimately, you know, Bono and U2 became one of the iPod's greatest salesmen.
On the 28th of April, 2003, after months of wrangling with executives and artists, Apple launched the iTunes Music Store. With more than 200,000 songs from the 5 major labels, Jobs' idea had become a reality.
Steve made this his personal mission, and he pushed those record company CEOs to make it theirs. At one point, there was a new prototype of the music store coming out. He hadn't seen it yet. His staff was about to present it to me. He got distracted for literally a half an hour talking about the font size and the location of like 3 words on the homepage. It was the most intense level of detail I've ever seen from a CEO. It was both impressive and kind of shocking.
In many ways, launching the iTunes Music Store was actually a bigger accomplishment than launching the iPod in terms of the complication. There's so many different details. For one song, there could be 5 different rights holders, and all of those people have to come to the table. Everyone has to sign the dotted line, and then to take all of that licensing and to put it into a format that has one price. This is really Herculean.
Jobs' hard work paid off. Within 5 days of its launch, the iTunes Music Store sold more than 1 million songs. Steve Jobs and Apple had accomplished something that no other company could, offering consumers a digital music player with a dedicated music store. That same day, Jobs made another announcement that further helped the iPod's growth.
Thank you. It's our 3rd generation. No one's even caught up with our 1st generation yet, and we're introducing our 3rd.
It was the first iPod to offer full PC compatibility. Now anyone with a computer could use an iPod.
The iPod was just for Mac fans, and it was a big success with Mac people. Steve Jobs let it percolate for a while, let the demand build, let the interest build, let the media build. But when Apple made it Windows compatible, hundreds of millions of people could try this thing out, and that's when the iPod just went nuts.
When Apple allowed the iPod to be PC compatible, the rush to use it was phenomenal. It was almost as if the PC users wanted a piece of Apple, wanted a bite of the apple. They wanted the coolness and the creativity that Apple had always stood for.
There's a big change in Apple's mindset. I mean, they were always hoping that the iPod would be a way to sell more Macs. But when they made it a Windows device, they threw that strategy out the window. They just decided, you know, okay, we'll focus on the iPod. Let's make that the big seller.
For a long time, Mac people and Windows people had this sort of cocktail party thing going on where the Mac people would say, you know, my Mac is so elegant and so beautiful, rounded corners on the screen image. I mean, little crossfades when you copy or delete an icon on the screen. It's beautiful. And the Windows person would go, but I can get a Dell for $400. You know, total disconnect. They totally do not understand each other. It's red state, blue state. It's Hummer, Prius. It's total disconnect. But the thing about the iPod was the iPod introduced those Windows PC people to the joy of having something that worked right, worked every time, and was beautiful.
The iPod's $1 billion business in 2 years. That's got to get our attention.
In the summer of 2004, we realized in Newsweek that the iPod was much more than a product. It was really becoming a cultural phenomenon. So we set out to do a cover story on it. And as it turned out, Steve Jobs, he had that same realization too. And he told me that a few months before, he had been in New York City and was walking down Madison Avenue. And he saw people walking down the street, and one by one, they had the earbuds. You go down the block, then there'd be another, then there'd be another, then another. And he said to himself, oh my God, it's starting to happen.
iPod sales skyrocketed. By the end of 2004, Apple had sold 200 million songs from the iTunes Music Store and over 6 million iPods. In 2005, sensing its growing popularity, Jobs aggressively launched new iPod models and updated existing versions. It seemed there was an iPod in every size and for most sizes of wallet.
You ever wonder what this pocket's for? I've always wondered that. Well, now we know.
because this is the new iPod Nano.
The strategy that Steve Jobs has was that once he had the first player out, it was just expanding more and more to meet every style, taste, preference, price point. So it makes it very hard for different competitors to come in and attack niches or market opportunities because they're basically trying to cover the whole gamut of consumer taste.
Then in October 2005, Apple released the 5th generation iPod with a feature that even Jobs had his doubts about. It was the first iPod that could play video.
In October of 2005, Apple did something that Steve Jobs said they were never going to do, which was add support for video to the iPod. And Steve had said for a long time that the experience of watching video on a portable device is never going to be as satisfactory or as integral as audio is going to be.
Steve Jobs was against a video iPod in public, but he's also this master gamesman. So the idea was that by talking against video assets or integrating video into an iPod, it would discourage other competitors from aggressively moving into the area. So that's kind of the conspiracy theory behind it.
In 2005, Apple released 4 new iPods across 4 different price points. Again, the strategy worked. That year, Apple sold 32 million iPods. That's one every second. The company reported that iPod sales made up 40% of the UK market, 45% in Canada, and 58% in Australia. Perhaps most important, it had a 75% ownership of the lucrative American MP3 player market.
When you look at Apple's market share, and they've held this 3/4 market share for 5 years now, and in any other business, if you've got 30% of the market share, that's huge. 75% is absolutely unheard of. And the reason is Apple has stayed ahead of their competitors. They've introduced products that were simply unmatched in the market.
In September 2006, the iTunes Music Store sold its 1.5 billionth song. It now sells more than 3 million songs every day. Apple is the 5th largest music retailer in the US. And in 2006, iTunes held 44% of the digital music market in the UK, more than 3 times its nearest competitor.
The digital downloads are still a fraction of the CD business. Let's be clear, they're not overtaking Walmart anytime in the near future because there's still a lot more CDs sold. But the fact that even they're on the charts, the fact that they're in the rankings is absolutely amazing. If 5 years ago I said, 5 years from now, the 5th largest music distributor is going to be Apple, you would probably have suggested I go lie down for a while.
Within a week of announcing that iTunes would offer full-length feature films, Apple sold more than 125,000 digital movies, making it clear the company is ready to tackle the digital film business as well. But the iPod's success is fueled by more than clever engineering and savvy marketing. This little device somehow seems to inspire passion in its owners. In just 4 years, the iPod went from a concept to an economic juggernaut. But perhaps the thing that distinguishes the iPod most is people's bizarre love for the gadget.
The fact that 80% of Microsoft employees who have music players are said to have iPods rather than the ones running Microsoft software is a telltale sign.
The iPod has gone to a cult-like status. It's something that people have affection for. Even as products become technically competitive, consumers want the iPod brand. They don't want anything else.
Today, users are showing love for their iPods in all sorts of ways. Some owners create homemade commercials, like this one from an iPod owner in California. Others pay an online business to turn their photos into personalised iPod ads.
Oh, his face is great. That kid's face is great.
And some iFanatics upload pictures of their iPods to a worldwide virtual photo gallery. Over 4,000 iPod owners have proudly posted pics of their beloved white devices for everyone to admire. Other fans are so fascinated with what the future holds for the iPod that they're mocking up and posting their own versions of possible next-generation iPods, such as this full-screen video iPod.
They care about the iPod. You don't see them mocking up what the next, HP laptop is going to be. It's only the iPod that people seem to do this with.
And at universities around the world, they're even teaching classes on it. Dr. Michael Bull, nicknamed Professor iPod, teaches at the University of Sussex.
Now, for the first time, this has meant people can construct their own auditory sound world wherever they go.
On some university campuses, the iPod influences the social dynamic.
There's a funny story. Duke University a couple years ago started a pilot program where every incoming freshman was issued an iPod, as an educational tool, mind you. So the upperclassmen were somewhat resentful seeing these freshmen walk around with their free iPods, and the white earbuds branded them as freshmen. So the upperclassmen who had iPods began to go shop for earbuds in other colors so people wouldn't think that they were freshmen.
The socialization of the iPod in youth culture is really important. It's an important part of their success. And the iPod kind of started this culture of the playlist and what the playlist has started to mean. So when you were able to suddenly create your playlist like a DJ, then suddenly everybody, your friends started to know you based on the kinds of playlists that you were creating and publishing. And it became an extension of who you are.
They did this survey recently where trying to figure out what the most popular thing is on college campuses. It's always beer. Every year it's beer. The last one that they did, the iPod has actually surpassed beer as the most popular thing on college campuses.
All this love for the iPod translates into big business, and not just for Apple. The device has given birth to a cottage industry of over 3,000 accessories, from iPod cases and car adapters to iPod pets and docking stations designed to keep your iPod close at all times. This iPod ecosystem is expected to generate sales of more than $1 billion.
I heard an analyst say, Apple can't maintain its market share with this iPod. You know what? I think he's wrong. The average iPod owner spends like $100 on accessories, car adapters, the FM radio attachment, and then there's all the music they bought from Apple's music store online. Those songs will only work on the iPod. That's an investment that they're not going to junk for some other player.
In the iPod, Steve Jobs has achieved the Holy Grail. A product that has become a cultural phenomenon and a billion-dollar business.
I think the iPod gives people this amazing, unprecedented level of power and personalization. And it's a lot of power that they've never felt before. And so they love this product, and it becomes an extension of their identity.
I think, what the iPod did is it gave people a way to relate to their music that was new, and it let them rediscover a lot of the stuff they already had and help them listen to it in different ways and consume their music in a way that they were never able to before. And that makes you feel good when you're like, I'm into music again. I'm carrying music around like I never did before. I'm discovering stuff I own. And you associate that good feelings with the iPod. Because the main thing it does is it doesn't get in between you and your music.
Just like the Sony Walkman revolutionized portable music listening 20 years ago, in the digital age, the iPod is doing exactly the same thing.
And it all started with a smile.
From Steve's perspective, he's finally got respect. And the iPod is what did it. Here he had championed something that people had thought, wow, you're a little crazy to do an MP3 player. And now the thing had become a phenomenal success. Apple was always considered a sort of a novelty, an interesting piece outside the main game being Microsoft and Windows and the PC world. The iPod has brought Apple into everybody's life. This is a big change, and I think it's going to lead to gigantic things for Apple. I think they've only just begun.